Okay, folks, welcome, one and all. We're delighted to have you here in the room and the wonderful Rizzo Center, and also you folks online. Delighted to welcome you to today's dialogue seminar, Piracy in Two Worlds. Before we begin, the folks in the room, if I could ask you to turn off your cell phones and other noise-making devices for the comfort of you, the audience, and the speaker. I don't really care, but if you're out there watching on your phone, please don't turn off your phone or else you'll miss the event. Let me see here. Who am I? I'm Max Orr, Executive Director of Carolina Public Humanities. We're the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm also our first speaker. I'm doing double duty today. Before we begin, I want to, for those that don't know who we are, what we do, we are Carolina Public Humanities, the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences. And it's our job to make sure that scholarship, faculty, and the resources of the university are shared with communities all over the state. We do that through these types of programs, Great Books reading groups at Flyleaf Books, lecture series, locally special events. And of course, we have a very extensive K-12 program, Carolina K-12, and do state outreach with community colleges and libraries across the state. We have a few people to thank. Of course, I want to thank the Rizzo Center. We always enjoy working at this very beautiful facility, and all of us in humanities get very jealous of the business school for their wonderful facilities, but it's great to be here. I want to thank our sponsors, the Cotton Farm Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley and the North Caroliniana Society, both of whom are fund our teacher workshop programs and do really excellent work. Also like to thank the Wayne County Friends of Public Education for supporting our teacher workshops as well. We need to thank our friends, the General Alumni Association, with whom we put on many programs. And of course, they sponsor our Humanities in Action work at Flyleaf Books. And also I'd like to thank our external advisory board. Would members of our external advisory board raise their hands up high for us so I can thank you there? We have Margaret Avery, Paul Connick, and Joe Rytock. I want to take one moment though to have a very special acknowledgement of Joe Rytock, chair of our board, I'm going to get a little verklempt here, is leaving us after 4,000 years of service. As the president of our external advisory board, his term ends on June 30th, and he's moving to Charlotte on Monday. So let's put our hands together and thank Joe for the incredible work. Can't thank you enough. Joe, if you're at the seminar next week, I'll have to do this all again. But this might be your last seminar as the chair. So we've had a good ride, hadn't we? So fantastic. I also want to thank Paul Bonici back there doing all the work, making sure you folks out in the ether can hear us. And also, of course, want to thank Beth Gardner, our new CPH events manager. Let's put our hands together for Beth. Already has just seamlessly slipped into our work. Yesterday was Vicki Breeden's last day. We miss her tremendously, but we know we're in good hands with Beth. So thank you, Beth, for being here. I also want to thank you, the audience, for being here. Your commitment to learning is always inspiring. That you could take a beautiful day like today and come and spend some time educating yourselves and learning about topics is always, again, a real inspiration for all of us. Quickly, I want to explain what we're doing. Inside your packets, you will see your agenda here, Pirates and Piracy. We have two speakers, moi and Monsieur Ewen, over here. We'll each have an hour and 50 minutes. We'll talk for about 50 or 60 minutes. I'll try not to rush. I'll also try not to take up too much of my time, so that you have time for questions during the question and answer phase. At least during my session and Dr. Ewen's session, I'll go around and get your questions on the microphone so that all you out there can hear it. And then we'll have a panel session at the end. As you know, snacks are right outside. So during our break, go out and use the refreshments there and get refreshed. We have insider packets. We have bios here. I will not be reading the biographies of myself and our other person. You can take a look at who they are, who is speaking today. Of course, we are very interested in your thoughts. So we have our evaluation. We love your praise. We are interested in your comments and we take your criticism very seriously. So please let us know what you think. And also let us know what you would like to learn about. We can find the scholars and the faculty to talk about some topic you're interested. We will certainly give that a shot. On the other side of your package here, you have the list of everybody who's here. You can play the match the name tag to the list game if you would like. There's no prizes for that. And I just want to draw your attention to one other special list. You'll see at the very back here, the Program in the Humanities alumni, where we count we know how many of these events you've been to, and we actually celebrate when you hit certain marks on a quartile system. And when you reach 25 of these events, you become a Program in the Humanities giant. And we are very happy to welcome someone back. After 3 years of absence, William Dick is a Program in Humanities giant. Can you believe it? Put your hands together. So there you are. Absolutely. We waited 3 years for this moment, but it's come through. So that's what COVID does to us, folks. So I also, if this is your first seminar, raise your hands up high. This is your very first seminar with us. We'd like to thank you for being committed to learning. I'm going to give you out some of these name cards. The one secret about, these little cards here, the only secret about them is that they can only be used to invite people to seminars. You can use them for whatever you want. Thank you for coming. And we have some wonderful quotations on there to inspire you. And so thank you for coming. And if you are one of the ambassadors, like Bill Andrews and others who have brought people, we are absolutely thankful. And please spread the word far and wide. Okay, the origins of this seminar. In the summertime, we try to pick fun topics like murder on the sea. And we were pulling this together. So how about pirates? We've worked with Charlie before, Dr. Ewen before, and we know that he gives a wonderful presentation on just everything you should know about pirates, as you'll see. And so what could that go with? We thought about internet piracy. We thought about maybe the Somalian pirate situation today. And then I opened up my mouth and said, well, I talk about the Barbary pirates for about 15 minutes in my entire class on France and Algeria. And they were like, bingo. So this is my angle of entry is actually French-Algerian history, which I know a considerable amount about. There it is. So let's not waste any more time. We got a little bit of a late start. Let's get right to what it is that I hope will be able to demonstrate to you my knowledge gained in the past month or so. I've learned a lot. If you have questions at the end of it, I sure hope I can answer them. Okay, Barbary pirates. Again, I'm not going to read my bio. I'll just give you a fake bio. I served as a galley slave for 25 years in the 16th century. I know all about this. I read a lot of Fernand Braudel's giant 2-volume history of the Mediterranean. It's his magisterial work. I won't say I read it all. I had to do that for comps. It's absolutely huge. I've read my share of adventure novels, and Barbary pirates have come in and out of them. So that was my entryway. But as I mentioned, I do know a fair amount about the history of France and Algeria. So I thought, why don't I start with my strongest suit, and that is starting at the end. So starting at the end of Barbary piracy with the French conquest of Algiers in 1830. France and Algeria had this long and stormy relationship for centuries, but it had been largely peaceful. They had even been allies of sorts in the late 18th century. There was robust trade between these two polities. There was even a French trading concession in a port of Lacal in Algeria. And there's a little story about debt. Napoleon in 1796, when he was a general for the French Republic, was on campaign and he needed grain. So he sent some emissaries down to Genoa, and they found some merchants who said, we got good deals on grain in Algeria. So they make for this big transfer. And of course, Napoleon being Napoleon never pays his bills, and the Genoese don't get money. And then this debt becomes the French government's debt. The Restoration government after Napoleon is not interested in paying his debts, obviously. So this becomes a long-standing feud where the Algerians are saying the French owe us this money. The King Charles X won't communicate with the Dey of Algiers because he's not technically a king. This is Hussein Dey here on the left. And in 1827, the emissary, the consul sent down to negotiate this whole thing, tells the Dey that he won't talk to you, you're not a king. And the Dey of Algiers whips him with a fan or a fly swatter. We're not sure what it is. It comes to be known as the fan incident. The French get very upset. They bombard the port. That's this picture here. Actually, it's from 1827, the bombardment of the port of Algiers. In later 1830, In the summer of 1830, there's a political crisis going on. Many of you might know that the revolution of 1830 happens in July of 1830, but early in that summer, Charles X decides for a little political distraction, maybe take down the heat of the politics at home and invade Algiers. And that's exactly what they do. Algiers falls on July 5th. The Dey goes into exile. Interestingly enough, King Charles X himself abdicates on August 2nd. So everybody got their due. And this ended 3 centuries of what we call the Barbary pirates. Their disruptive presence in the Mediterranean ceases permanently after this moment. And this story has many of the main elements that we'll be talking about. It has merchants, it has big states like France making deals with pirate states. It has trade disputes, blood feuds, personal politics, and of course, naval action. All of this stuff is the stuff of the Barbary pirates legend. So let's think, what are we talking about with Barbary pirates? Pirates, Merriam-Webster, people who engage in piracy. Piracy, an act of robbery on the high seas, also an act resembling such robbery, or just robbery on the high seas. And what about these particular pirates? Well, they're known by other names. Sometimes they're called corsairs, sometimes Turks, sometimes incorrectly called Saracens. What are some ideas we have about them? Well, they're Muslim and Arab. They're a menace on the seas. They intervene with the Western historical narrative, just sort of in and out of the big picture. We hear this little nuisance in the Mediterranean. Maybe some of you have sort of an Orientalist vision of like Charles, who was at Charlton Heston rowing and being whipped by a mean person, you know. And of course, many Americans know our first foreign war, from the halls of Montezuma to the, you got it, right? And that's the extent of a lot of people's knowledge of the Barbary pirates. And that, hey, you know, that's a pretty good base. It's a good place to start. We'll see what else we can find out about them. This name, Barbary. Why the place name? The original inhabitants of this region were non-Arab Indo-European groups that came to be known as Berbers by the Romans, something they never called themselves. They would call themselves Tanexap, Kabyle, and any other number of names. This, of course, comes from the Greek barbaroi, for barbarian. So this is the classification of the people that he met there. Not nice. And it became the classification of the whole area. It's the Barbary coast. Carthage, then Rome, then the Vandals, and the Byzantines, and the Arabs, and Berber kingdoms, and then the Ottoman Turks had all fought over and invaded this area and added layer upon layer of culture to this area. It was fought over between Muslims and Christians, and within faiths for over 800 years. And the ports are the important feature. The ports of Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, Saleh, they really defined this as the coast. These ports were occupied at various times by Crusaders, by Spanish, by the French, by Italian city-states, and other European polities at different moments in times in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. And all Europeans called this the Barbary coast. The people that lived there call it the Maghreb. It's not the Barbary coast. So that's where we get the name for these people, this misnomer for the place. So we come to an important point. Why these scare quotes? I love this line. Please do not use staples for posting. Please do not use quotation marks for emphasis. Why do I use these? Why do I use these scare quotes? Well, I think an important starting point for us to understand is they're not Barbary and they're not pirates. And we'll explain why this is soon. We're going to learn pirates are thieves. They are outside the law. Pirate is a defamatory label, a convenient moniker for Europeans who for centuries engaged in identical behavior until they used the excuse of extirpation to control North Africa themselves. They would have referred to themselves most likely as Ghazi, holy warriors, and will do so through most of the lecture, although I will slip back into calling them pirates quite a bit. The seaborne raiders that came out of North African ports considered themselves law-abiding soldiers who answered to their captain, to the leader of the city from which they came, to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, and to their interpretation of Sharia law. They justified their behavior as falling under the mandate to conduct holy war against the infidel. So we have some key takeaways. And one of the things I learned is that you should never read from your slides because it's really boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make y'all read from my slides. I'm going to start with Paul. Are you okay if I make you read this? Yeah, exactly. Well, you're one row back, right? So here we go. Here's the first one.
Okay. Quote, Barbary piracy, end quote, was a highly developed example of piratical behavior practiced in the Mediterranean for millennia by people of all types. It was not a sudden anomaly of the Muslim population of North Africa, and the behavior of, quote, Barbary pirates, end quote, was often matched by their Christian adversaries.
So let's hear it from Paul Connick. Point one. Can I count on you, David? Absolutely. All right. Point two.
Barbary piracy, in quotes, is inseparable from the concept of holy war between Muslims and Christians in the early modern era. The captains had God on their side.
All right. Let's hear it for David. Bruce, you ready to take number three?
Yeah. Barbary piracy was a state-run enterprise, not a criminal activity, and must be understood in political terms. The captains were carrying out state policy, even when acting independently.
Hear it for Bruce Hook. There you go. These are three things that I guess I don't need to use this anymore. These are three things that I hope will be clear by the end of our slides here today. Now, listen, are there exceptions? Absolutely. Are there straight up pirates involved in this story? Absolutely. And there are plenty of rogues who don't follow the rules, to be clear. Violence breeds immorality. But if you followed some of the rules, you got to operate out of a friendly home port. And of course, the last 2 points on the slide are great justifications for bad behavior. So we know that there's going to be some fuzzy areas here. So why don't we all travel to the Mediterranean, splash down? Wouldn't that be nice right now? All right, the Mediterranean, it's big. It's over 2,000 miles across. It's big, but it's also small. And what I mean by that is that you got nooks and crannies and little straits and all sorts of places where, it feels close to shore, if you will. And that's an important concept. I found this map, which I thought was really helpful to kind of envision the Mediterranean. And wouldn't it be fun to take like a boat from Chapel Hill, which is essentially Beirut, and go all the way up to Chicago, which is essentially Istanbul? Yeah, that'd be fun. All right. It's big. I mean, I just put this up for comparison, give you a sense of how large it is. But then again, those areas where it gets constricted and small are very important. This area, as I'm sure you know, is a large, diverse trading zone for millennia. So here we have a picture of European trade routes from the late Middle Ages. It's a very Eurocentric perspective. And of course, it's extremely simplified. I want you to imagine instead thousands of lines across this ocean. Add all the routes to trade routes outside of Christendom, going from Alexandria to Istanbul, for example. Add all the local trade, the most common trade along the coastlines, local trade. Add the fishing vessels, and you'll see that this is a lake full of boats, as the slide says. And we're not just talking about the famed goods of the East, spices, silks, tea, etc., or high value goods like gold and other precious metals, and frankly, slaves. We're also talking about mundane things like timber, olive oil, foodstuffs, grains, textiles, etc. And where there is trade, there is theft. Is that a pretty good maxim? I think we can say that. I've yet to find a market that doesn't have somebody cheating in it. Okay, so we have to think about this concept. Is it organized crime on the seas? I don't want to shock you all, but the maritime industry has been a haven for crime since the ancient period. Ports have been run by organized crime from antiquity to this day. Piracy, understood as theft at sea without state sanction, has a long pedigree in the Mediterranean. And there are some distinctive Mediterranean features of this piracy that sort of resemble mafia culture, a Mediterranean type of attitude towards personal aggrandizement in your relations with your family. Blood feuds and vendettas, loyalty pledges, codes of conduct with extreme violence used to enforce them, and of course, brutish, cruel behavior to instill terror. And this is what mafiosos do. And this is what these pirates do: thievery at sea, raiding from the sea onto the shore, customs, protection schemes, unasked for help, if you will, human trafficking, hostage taking, guns for hire, and of course, just straight murder, again, for the purpose of instilling terror. And just as mafioso culture could be hyper-local, so too was a lot of piratical behavior. But just like mafia families, criminals on the seas can get organized to wield considerable power. In their minds, Barbary pirates were not committing crimes. I want to be clear about that. War crimes for sure, but not crime as we understood it with other pirates. Piracy getting organized is an old tradition as well. You put this in the context of Mediterranean thalassocracies. I'm so glad I got to use that word, right? Seaborne powers, right? And the Mediterranean is full of these: Minoans, Phoenicians, Athenians, Carthaginians, to some extent Romans, Venetians, Portuguese. All of these are thalassocratic, Now I can't say it. See what I did to myself? Thalassocracies. Yeah, exactly. You don't. It's like archipelago. Oh, damn, I did it. So, in the absence of strong thalassocracies, piracy can organize and almost assume a sort of loose thalassocratic form itself, right? And exert government control, if you will. And you think of things like the Sea Peoples pictured here, Ramsay's victory over the Sea Peoples. Some people call them the Sheridan pirates. In this context, we can see these as essentially large organized piracy, right? The last, so, all right. If we go to Greece, certainly, here's Dionysus punishing the pirates. And remember this myth where he's, I think they jump in the water and I think they turn into dolphins or something like that when they won't help him, and only one person on the ship helps him. But again, just the point that this piracy enters into the mythology of the ancient and classical era. This, of course, is in Tunis, gives you a sense of that Mediterranean culture that's reacting to the same stories and the same myths. And the criminal impulse in piracy is not constant. Again, I think it's much more common for piracy, and this is something Dr. Ewen and I talked about in prepping. It's much more common for piracy to be really kind of small scale and local, really contingent response to an opportunity or a need. So a fishing village has a bad catch, but the people over around the cove had a pretty good year. We got to this, or there's a foreign ship foundering off the coast. Maybe we should go help it, right? Again, so you look here, this old history of this, and we can also go to Thucydides, who talks about pirates. And again, we don't read ourselves, but I know Byron's got a fantastic voice. Byron, can you read this for us?
I believe so. For in early times, the Hellenes and the Barbarians of the coast and islands, as communication by sea became more common, were tempted to turn pirates. Under the contact of their most powerful men, the motives being to serve their own cupidity and to support the needy, they would fall upon a town unprotected by walls and consisting of a mere collection of villages, and would plunder it. Indeed, they came to be the main source of their livelihood, no disgrace being yet attached to such an achievement, but even some glory.
Byron Braswell, everybody. Also known as Thucydides. So listen, I want to say one thing at the end here, and this is something I know will come up in our next talk. Piracy and glory and celebrity have always gone together as well. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure, today. We also have times when the Mediterranean was pretty safe. The Cilician pirates were another one of these groups that began to exert considerable control in the 1st century BCE. Julius Caesar was captured by them and ransomed off. Pompey, Julius Caesar's one-time ally and then eventually enemy, was charged with clearing the seas of piracy, and he divided the Mediterranean Ocean up into a grid system and really got rid of the piracy. And you could say for most of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, the sea Mare Nostrum was our sea was relatively calm. Small scale piracy never went away, but this large organized thalassocratic piracy was no longer an issue for several hundred years during the Roman Empire. Nothing lasts forever. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure can fall. And after the Pax Romana, near constant wars of all kinds in the Mediterranean for the next millennia made violence on the seas and raids on the land the norm for centuries. And then with it, of course, piracy at all levels reemerges and becomes a major feature of sea life on the Mediterranean. Every single part of the coast of the Mediterranean in the what we might call the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages had pirate groups, criminal bands, also organized raiding groups in service to the state or religious leaders or organizations. Now, are those second group pirates? They would say no. They would say they're acting out, but they act just like pirates. We have the Saracens from the 7th century on. These are Muslim Arab pirates routinely attacking the Greek islands and Italy as the tip of the spear of Islam's advance. Again, they would not consider themselves pirates. They're holy warriors. We have crusaders engaged in piratical action against Muslim ships and shores. The Knights of St. John were organized sea warriors, of course, on the island of Rhodes and later Malta. They were called pirates by their Muslim enemies. The Catalan Company was a massive mercenary group hired by the Byzantines in the 14th century that went rogue and essentially controlled the Aegean through much of the 14th century. In the Adriatic, we had the pagan Neretanians out of the Neretva River in the 9th to 11th century, and the Uskoks out of Senge, contemporaneous with the subject we're going to be talking about, the entering of the Barbary pirates. These are all organized pirate groups, loosely affiliated with state causes, but essentially running like states themselves. In this early modern period, this form of what I think we can call it irregular seaborne warfare, right? Irregular sea attacking merchants and engaging in piratical behavior was not just between European Christians and Muslims, but also was between European countries, especially the city-states of the Italian peninsula. Here's the Genoese fleet in 1597. Let me tell you, these fleets, if you saw them on the horizon and you weren't Genoese, they might as well be pirates. If you think about the character of Othello, it's an example of what this mercenary culture of the Middle Ages was, the condottieri mercenary culture that really bleeds right into piracy. Allegiance shifted constantly, and there was ample opportunity for a pirate to find employment in one of these conflicts. And as I know, Dr. Ewen and I will both acknowledge, privateering and piracy are long bedfellows as well. In Renaissance Italy, ship captains or even admirals of whole fleets would sell their services to either side of a conflict or go rogue altogether. Someone like Andrea Doria had served on various city-states, although primarily Genoa. In the late 15th century, the Archbishop and Doge of Genoa, Paolo Campofregeso, stole part of the city's fleet after being toppled in a coup and raided along the Italian coast in retribution. Later on, he was also a papal admiral in wars against the Ottomans. And as we'll see later in a few slides, some of the most famous Barbary pirates were indeed European ship captains. They were called renegades, who in return for converting to Islam would gain great wealth and power attacking Christian ships. So that's the background, trying to show you that this culture of piracy, it has a long pedigree in the Mediterranean. But let's get to the Barbary pirates. We can date Barbary pirates to the Ottoman expansion into Western Mediterranean, especially the years around 1500 to 1571. After Constantinople falls in 1453, you can see the expansion, Algiers in 1516, Egypt in 1517, Rhodes in 1523, Tripoli in 1551, Tunis in 1534, and then again in 1574. As I mentioned, these ports are fought over with Europeans. When the Turks took these ports in North Africa, the Barbary coast became their area of main naval activity as they had tried to expand into the Western Mediterranean. This was a holy war, and the Barbary pirates were Ghazi, holy warriors in this struggle. There's constant warfare on the Mediterranean for over a century between the Ottoman Empire in the West, especially the Habsburgs, Charles V and Philip II. And this is important. This is what we call maybe the first phase of the Barbary pirates. And this is when the Barbary pirates get a bad rap. The behavior of Muslim sea captains in this era of the 16th century was mirrored in important ways by their Christian adversaries. Both sides engaged in raiding shores and burning whole towns, attacking shipping, stealing goods, enslaving people, sometimes on a mass scale. And all of this was sanctioned by their states and by their obligation to conduct holy war. If this brutal warfare was piracy, everyone was a pirate at this time. And again, I want to always stress, admittedly, captains could go rogue and act independently or even criminally, but then return to duty, carrying out the actions of the holy war. So pirate was also contingent concept. The Ottomans were not a seafaring people. And when they took over the coastlines of the Mediterranean, they would pull their greatest commanders from conquered communities along the coast. Albanians, Italians, Greeks, Corsicans, Spaniards, all served in the Ottoman Navy. And sometimes they would take children, of course, just like they did for the Janissaries, take children and kidnap them and convert them, and they would become the captains. These captains acted independently. They often controlled whole fleets of their own with subordinate captains loyal to them. And though often independent, they were always Ottoman soldiers, owing a share of their booty as tribute to the Sultan. They would often have Turkish soldiers called Janissaries. We'll talk about them throughout the lecture here on board, and they could be called for major naval action. When the Sultan decides they're going to invade certain place, they call their pirate friends, their captains, and they become the admirals of these areas. They also were the kings of several of these ports at various times. So the key players were the Barbarossa brothers. Rouge was the one who captured Algiers in 1516. He, unfortunately for him, was killed in 1518, but his brother dyed his beard red to match his brother. And his brother is this one here, Hayreddin Barbarossa, which means a red beard. There's a lot of pirate names that have to do with beards. Redbeard, again, becomes a hero of the Muslim world. The great Dragut, here we have over on the side, started out as lieutenant of Barbarossa. He became the Grand Admiral of all Ottoman fleets. He also ruled Algiers for a spell. And Dragut's story is filled with adventure, grand raids on Christian coasts, capturing slaves, being captured himself and serving 4 years as a galley slave on a Genoese galley. And then he finally was killed in the failed siege of Malta in 1565. To this point I made earlier about pirate and celebrity, these were famous people. They were absolutely feared in the West. They're notorious legend, and again celebrated in the Muslim world. Here's a statue in Tunis of Dragut, the great admiral of the Ottoman fleet. I do want to make a point about holy war, and I think anyone who studied history knows this. Sometimes you got to break the rules a little bit. Sometimes politics demand a little bit of relaxing your religious fervor. And this is certainly the case. This holy war was only holy so long as realpolitik didn't intervene. France and Spain were also inveterate enemies over the 16th century, especially over Italy. And so naturally, the enemy of my enemy logic prevails. Here you see Barbarossa, Redbeard, the most feared pirate of all of the Mediterranean, wintering in the port of Toulon in 1534 at the invitation of the French king, Francis. The fleet, by the way, this scared the hell out of the populace. They pulled all the Christians out of the town, and they lived there for the whole winter without, molesting the Christian population. When they left accompanied by the French fleet under Admiral Paulin, and together the two of them raided towns up and down the coast of Italy. So who's the pirate now, right? Again, this is one of our takeaways, and we talked about the 3 points earlier that underlying the political nature of piracy in the Mediterranean. It was understood as a feature of politics in the region, and deft players could use it to their advantage, making these alliances. And we'll see this again later, even in the 18th century, in a very different way. So we call this sort of the first phase of the Barbary pirates, this 16th century, much characterized by large-scale naval action, characterized by a concerted nonstop effort of the Ottoman Empire to take over the Western Mediterranean. So a tight relation to the Ottoman state and large-scale action. This comes to an end at the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This was the last great action between fleets of galleys. It was a great victory for the Christians, and it ended the threat to the Western Mediterranean of an Ottoman takeover. Pirates were there. One whole wing of the Ottoman fleet, 1/3 of the ships, was commanded by a renegade pirate, Pirate Urujali or Occhiali, who was an Italian. He was captured at 17 from Calabria, and he turned Turk. As they say, this is what they call it. If you convert, you turn Turk, and went over to the other side. He also had a turn as the ruler of Algiers. And there's some great stories about him raiding the Italian coast, trying to see his mother, who refused to see him until he went back to Christianity. Again, there's so many great stories. I wish I could just tell all the stories only. So Lepanto entered this threat, if not the threat of a continued pirate presence. The Great Holy War is no longer the context for understanding the Barbary pirates. This was more of a pirate affair, if you will, after this century. But to be clear, the captains never let go of the religious justification for their actions. Unless there was some agreement that was accepted, and we'll talk about that in later slides, all Christian boats and shores are fair game. They're justified. They're not engaging in criminal activity, even though, anyway, it looks like it, right? So we get to the sort of the second phase here, where we can begin to talk about the Barbary coast and these as somewhat independent states. Again, the captains, or reis, R-E-I-S, excuse me, the Turkish word for captain, would likely, again, consider themselves Ghazi or holy warriors. They would never use the word pirate for themselves. And so we'll try not to call this area Barbary. And so some scholars refer to this as the Ghazi states of North Africa. The 3 eastern cities listed were under nominal Ottoman suzerainty. Saleh and ports in Morocco were under the more direct control of the Sultan of Morocco, although Saleh becomes a pirate republic for a few decades in the 17th century. There are also many, many small little ports and coves, Bougie, Sfax, Mahdia, Jerba, Bone, Honain, and others. Although, interestingly enough, North Africa is not really blessed with a lot of great harbors. So the main harbors are that much more important. After Lepanto in 1571, these states were increasingly left to their own devices, sending tribute to the Ottomans, but largely crafting their own way. Istanbul, for its part, would try to periodically reassert more control over them, but it never, again, could fully coordinate their activities. So I want to just sort of make sure we understand a chronological breakdown of 3 phases. The first phase being that great religious geopolitical battle of the 16th century. The second phase in the 17th century, in which they begin to act more independently, and their behavior looks a lot more like piracy as we know it. And they still wield a great amount of power in the 17th century. In the 18th century, they are weaker and have more formal relations with European states, but of course still engage in this form of piratical behavior for income. So how did they work? What did they do? Let's take a look at Algiers, the White City. It provides a good model for us. It was the biggest and most powerful of the ports. As I mentioned, the first day or ruler or pasha of Algiers was the Barbarossas. Hayreddin Barbarossa running Algiers for about 20 years or so. It was known as sort of a white triangle rising from the sea. You could see it for miles away, this bright white triangle rising up, called Algiers the Great, and has some unique features, but also some that are common to all Barbary states. I put this poem, I actually teach this poem in my France and Algeria course about the fall of Algiers. And there's a wonderful poem here that gives you a sense of how the citizens thought about it. Can I ask you to read? Would you like to read it? Okay. Don't be offended by the one line that's really offensive in it, okay?
Okay. Oh, regrets, how the port was embellished with fortifications and ships. Oh, regrets, Where are those captains, those billowing silken flags, and those corsairs not coming to anchor except with captured slaves and coffee? Those corsairs before whom the Christians were nothing more than women. Mhm.
Toxic masculinity there.
Algiers was a pincer to pull out teeth. The most courageous were afraid of her. Oh world, how was she taken? It is not this way we had thought of her with the Muslims of past centuries.
Mia Doran, folks, put your hands together. Yeah, that someone asked me about the gender politics of this. I'm not going to touch that here too much. As you can see, it had a reputation. People were very proud. The corsairs, the pirate activity was part of the pride of that city. It was an incredibly diverse place. Eyewitness accounts from the 17th century were counting the number of houses, but they had, of course, Turks, Kabyles, Arab, Bedouins, Andalusians, Jews, various renegade Christians. They said there were over 6,000 houses in Algiers that belonged to renegade Christians in the 17th century. So this is a bustling cosmopolitan city centered on its port. It is a very tiered society, however, with Turks and Turkish allied Muslims at the top. So how does a Ghazi state run? First of all, it was a dangerous job. You don't want the job of running Algiers. In the 313 years between Rouge Barbarossa taking over the city and 1830 when it fell, there were over 80 rulers, and by some accounts, you could say over 100 and so that's very short terms. If you add some of the terms are long, Barbarossa's got 20 years. The last day of Algiers had 15 years. You take out some of those long reigns, we're talking sometimes a few months, and there'll be another day coming in. In the 16th century, Ottomans controlled at least who ruled Algiers, and Algiers sent a regular tribute. In the 17th and 18th century, the Pasha becomes quasi-monarchical, de facto independent, and the tribute would still go to Istanbul, maybe. After 1671, we call the leaders their Dey. It becomes the main term, although some of them called themselves Sultan, which the person in Istanbul would not have liked. And this Dey became the product of an internal selection process from 1718 on. These places remain loyal to the Ottoman Empire in name. And again, there are going to be several interludes where there's more independence and even some hostile overtures at independence by the 18th century. How was the Dey chosen? A system of negotiation and conflict resolution in a body called the Divan, which was composed of Janissaries, the Turkish soldiers who were stationed. The Turkish soldiers and half-blood Turk and Arab people called Kaluglis would maintain the tie to Turkey. The influence of the Ottoman Empire could be felt through some of these Janissaries. And the ship captains, the Reises, were also members of the Divan, and together they would negotiate, again, or conflict resolute, or maybe they would kill each other, and a new Dey would be chosen from the Divan. The Deys had firm control over these Mediterranean seaports, but far less control over the interior. And if you'd like to learn about that, you can take my France and Algeria course in the later. We're not going to talk about the interior right now. Happy to answer questions. What about their boats? Let's get into some details here. These Reis, the Ghazi Reis, were excellent mariners, and they had all the same tools for navigation that Western ships did. They knew the sea. We can talk about the boats in some chronological order. The Mediterranean galley have been largely unchanged for about 1,000 years. This is the Kadurga, Turkish version of it. They could be carried, of course, before the age of gunpowder. They were carrying, hurled missiles and arrows and whatnot. But increasingly, they could be mounted with small cannon, etc., and swivel guns. Again, the last great galley battle being 1571, we're already well into the age of gunpowder by then. So you can see that accommodation made to gunpowder. In this top one, you can see actually firing a gun there. You don't want to be on the other end of that. Later, we get the, there's not a fine dividing line. These can work together. The galleass is a much larger version. The Turkish word for it is a mahona. These could get massive, by the way. They could sometimes mount as many as 15, 20 cannons and superstructures built on the front of them. They are another road vessel. But of course, the sails are there to help if you can, use the sails. But then when you need to chase a vessel into a harbor or whatnot, you break out the rowing. Finally, we see a move to sail primarily by the end of the, by the end of the 17th century and certainly by the 18th century. And the boats in general get smaller, the Zebek and the Polaka being these Latin rig, actually this one's square rig here. Fast, smaller boats, the complements get smaller. Later in the 18th century, you'll see some city fleets that had contemporaneous square rig vessels like you'd see in the British Navy or in the American Navy, but nothing larger than a frigate, if you're aware of your sort of classifications of boats. Most common way to think of them are small boats packed with people chasing. The one thing that's wrong about this particular picture, here's a Christian boat being chased. Boats would rarely go out by themselves. They would almost always be in packs and overwhelm another ship. I just a little aside, as I was doing this, I read a little thing where someone says, well, facing pirates had a great advancements in the way nautical technology worked and also in other sort of nautical traditions and ways of doing business. Convoys and signaling become very important to avoid pirates, working together with other merchants and doing the convoy system. Maritime insurance, hey, taken by pirates. State investment in coastal defenses and customs. International nautical jurisprudence all come from facing this idea of a lawless sea. And of course, countering the Barbary threat, Barbary piracy, with more advanced ships and professional crews. You see the birth of regular navies to face a near constant threat. Of course, they're always at war with each other too, so there's plenty of reasons to have regular navies. But in places like the Mediterranean, having a long-term professional naval presence. How would the Ghazi do their thing? What did they do? Well, each captain outfitted their ships at their own expense, but ships themselves could be owned by rich merchants or by the state. And again, going out in fleets was the most productive way to conduct business. Captains sometimes would strike out on their own, and there's always that, what we call that sort of small scale piracy that happens, that foundering ship off the coast, just go get it. So those all happen, but in general, it was a big deal to go out on a pirate expedition from one of these Ghazi ports. Average crew was around 200 oarsmen in the age of the road ships, and these complements did get smaller as the ships got smaller and we moved more to sail. They always had a complement of the janissaries or other types of soldiers on board, ranging from 20 to 100, depending on the size of the boat and the type of mission. There was also a whole industry of renting out oarsmen. So there were volunteer oarsmen too, which is not a great job, but you could get paid for it if you wanted. If you had a crew, you could rent it out to another crew. Most of these oarsmen are, of course, enslaved. Departure ceremony. The whole town would come down to the port for the departure of a Ghazi fleet. A ceremony was held. The imam would give blessings to every boat and to every captain and to the crew. There would be a sheep sacrificed, and the blood for each ship, and the blood would be dripped on either side of the boat to protect the boat. I don't know the religious justification for it, but it's a nice image. Now maybe it's not. If you're a sheep, it's a terrible image. It was a whole town event to come out to whoosh the fleets off. When they were out at sea, how did they attack? They would often, the best way is ambush, wait around the corner of a headland for the boats to come by and dash out and surround them. They used a common practice of flying flags of other nations. Now, this was very common. If you've read your Horatio Hornblower or your Patrick O'Brien, this is very common. You fly the wrong flag, and then right at the last minute, you put your own flag up. Well, they did that. They also would use their Christian crews, their renegade Christian crews, to hail boats in their native tongues. So you have an Italian who's gone rogue, hail that Italian ship and tell them that we're out of Genoa or something like that. Coming back empty-handed, not good, not good. So if there were no ships, you would raid the coastlines, Christian coastlines, and try to get slaves and goods that way. When you returned, there was also a huge ceremony. The returning Ghazi were welcomed again with citywide festivities and feasting, sometimes as long as a week. There would be a public divvying up of all the spoils and the slaves and booty, and the presentation to the Pasha or Dey of his 1/7 to 1/8 of all the booty. The Pasha or Dey would also get first choice of slaves. So, which brings us to probably an important topic we should talk about: slavery and hostages and human trafficking. Again, this is maybe the first thing we think of when we hear the word about these pirates or about the word galley. We think about the galley slaves. It is a really brutal. It's not a great way to get in shape. I know rowing machines are cool, but this is awful, awful stuff. Galley slaves were common. I want to be clear about that. In the age of using galleys, that's how all states powered their navies. And you could say whether that's prisoners serving a time, a 4-year sentence as a galley rower, that's a death sentence, right? So it's forced labor no matter what, but slavery on both sides, the Christian side and the Muslim side. Galley slaves were chained to their oars to go down with the ship because there's if you have more oarsmen than you have soldiers, you run a serious risk of mutiny, which is always, so they were kept brutally chained and of course treated brutally to prevent those mutinies. But galley slaves were only one form of enforced bondage. And again, this is perhaps the most notorious and maybe overblown and exaggerated part of Barbary pirates was their high volume slave trade. In that 16th century, to be clear, the numbers were outrageous. So Barbarossa would go and take a town on the Balearic Islands and enslave all 4,000 members of the village or the island. Christians in the Holy War also enslaved Muslim enemies as well. This ancient Mediterranean practice of the triumph in which you take your prisoners and march them in front of you, that was still practiced in the Mediterranean in this Holy War. But many slaves were brought back to Algiers to be sold. Piracy on the sea was the main source of income for these towns, and slavery was the highest yield product, if you will. A sale of 8 to 10 men captured would be worth more than a whole cargo of goods. Raiding brought in the slaves who worked the shipyards and the galleys, but it also provided most of the domestic work in Algiers and the unskilled hard labor in the cities, again, especially in the ports. As soon as people were captured, they were divided by worth, illustrious captives being held for ransom, suitable people separated out for domestic servants or artisans. And these were all separated from the clear future oarsmen and hard laborers. If a pirate caught a skilled seamen and carpenters and people who might be of value on the boat, they might be impressed directly into service on the boat itself. Younger women would be sold into sexual slavery in harems throughout Algiers. There's no good way to say this. This is human trafficking and sexual slavery. They might eat better and actually be treated on a day-to-day basis better, but rape is unforgivable, and that was part of what we're talking about here. Children might be sold, converted, and incorporated into families. So again, this is not chattel plantation slavery, but you can see its wide tentacles in all of these various sectors of society. It was a massive business. There was also a whole industry of liberation. Sometimes raiders would actually stay on shore or go to the port where the ship came from and said, "Hey, we got your people. You want to pay for them now?" Right? This is certainly cheaper than bringing back to Algiers, and you might be able to cheat the day out of one of their cuts, right? Everybody on the ship stays quiet about it. Dragut, remember I mentioned him, one of the great admirals of the Ottoman Navy. He set up a special market on a small Italian island with thousands of enslaved people and sent messengers to ports all around the Tyrrhenian Sea saying, "Hey, come and get your family. and basically sell back all of them. Although that, and there were sometimes prisoner swaps. So we've got, 20 Venetians and you've got 20 Turks and we'll swap them that way. The majority, though, would go back to Algiers and were never heard from again. However, Trinidadians, Mercedians, and other religious orders in the Catholic Church had special passes to the cities, to the Gaza cities, to negotiate for the release. And so there would be again, a whole industry of paying to get your people out of Algiers. Here you can see the negotiations for release. Now, the numbers. The high number that you'll read is 1.2 million Christians enslaved over the course of these 3 centuries. This is a very high number, doesn't count ransoms, doesn't count swaps, and it also doesn't count the types of conditions that people faced. Many people would choose to convert to Islam to get out of being a slave. You don't enslave a fellow Muslim, so you could get out of slavery through conversion. So again, these numbers are probably too high, but let's be clear, it was high volume, cruel and vicious, and a real phenomenon. Only reason I put these little scare quotes up there is that in the current political climate, there's sort of a, did you know that white Christians were enslaved as well? And yes, they were, in fact, but I want to put some caveats on how we understand that. We have some famous people who had to deal with this. Cervantes himself was part of this world. He fought at Lepanto. He spent years on a Christian ship fighting the Turks. He probably was called a pirate by people on the other side. He was captured off the coast of France in 1575 and spent 5 years as a prisoner. He was identified as a potential high value asset. So early on, he was treated well enough, but after attempting to escape, his compatriots were all hanged or impaled in front of him in public, and he spent the year crushing rocks in a quarry and transporting the stone back to Algiers. He tried to escape 4 times. He failed each time. He spent 2 stints of 5 months apiece chained to a wall in a pitch black dungeon. Finally, he was ransomed and returned to Spain to become one of the world's greatest writers. Now, there's no guarantee that that's the outcome of being ransomed. He had good negotiators, but yeah, it's a really fascinating story. There's a wonderful novel about that by Arturo Pérez Reverte, if you're interested in getting a fictitious account, but largely built off of true stories. An important point I mentioned before, I want to talk about them. In the late 16th century, a European eyewitness went to the port of Algiers, counted 34 pirate ships, and among the captains whose origins he knew, he counted 8 Turks, 7 Genoese, 3 Greeks, 1 Jew, 1 Hungarian, and a Spaniard. So if I add up all besides the Turks, that's at least 13 of the 34 ships, at least 13 of them were captained by renegades, Christian converts to Islam. And there are some famous people. So the Englishman Jack Ward, who somebody says that the Johnny Depp character in Pirates of the Caribbean is based off of. I'm not going to touch that. It was a privateer for Queen Elizabeth for a spell. He stole a ship, went to the Mediterranean, converted to Islam, and then served out of Saleh and then Tunis. Edward Coxier in 1616 said, quote, "It is said that he was the first to put the Turks to turn pirates at sea like himself." So again, post Lepanto, we do begin to say it's a little bit more looks like criminal activity. And when you have criminals like Jack Ward going down and offering their services, you can see why they're called pirates. The Dutchman Simon Danseker, he was a privateer for the Dutch Republic. He steals a ship in 1607 and goes to Algiers. If you steal a ship, go to the Ghazi coast. He settles in Algiers, marries the mayor's daughter. He was called Captain Crazy for his reckless daring. He switched sides several times between Christians and Muslims in the Mediterranean conflicts until the Dey of Tunis got tired of him and had him executed. Another Dutchman, Janzoen van Haarlem, known as Murad Rees. You'll notice they all take names. They all take Muslim names, and Rees meaning captain. He was elected the Grand Admiral, essentially the ruler of this short-lived Republic of Saleh in 1624. Again, he essentially rules this town filled with renegade captains in service of this holy war. Renegados were the most famous pirates in this post-Lepanto era, nefarious legends. And here we have some crossover actually into your world, in that people like Peter Easton, who spent much of his career off the coast of Newfoundland as a pirate, ends up going to the Mediterranean, pledging his loyalty to Tunis. Again, this is if you're doing piratical activities and you can ingratiate yourself with one of these cities, it's a good place to be. We have a little account of them, and I'm going to ask one of our lovely folks to read it for us. How would you like to be the reader? Stuart, brand new. Let's hear it. Put that right up to your mouth there.
In truth, they, the Turks, are not a very wicked-looking people. Rather, they are quiet and well-tempered in their manner. If it is possible to describe them like that, but the ones who have once been Christians and have forsaken their religion, although they dress like the Turks, are by far the worst of people and cruelly brutal to the Christians. It was they who bound those taken captive and wounded and killed people.
Let's hear it for Stuart. Yeah, so again, these are the bad guys, if you will, of the there's a lot of bad guys to go around in this topic, to be honest. So that author, by the way, Olafur Egilson, if you're wondering, that's not a very Mediterranean name, is it? That's because he was referring to the crews of Murad Reis, Jan Jansson, the leader of Saleh, who captured him in 1627 after a raid on Iceland. The Dutch leader of Saleh had often sailed into the Atlantic. And by the way, this was not uncommon for Barbary pirates to be working in the Atlantic as well, even going over to the Caribbean at times and coming back. In 1627, Murad Reis's raids on Iceland and ships from Saleh and Algiers killed about 40 people, and close to 400 of them were captured, including Olafur, and brought to Algiers to be sold into slavery. Only about 50 of them ever came back. And we have a little account. It's very short. I'm going to let Jerry read this one. A little account of Olaf here. What did he say?
Pirates were ashore so suddenly that the people found it hard to escape them. They rushed with violent speed across the island like hunting hounds, howling like wolves, and the weak women and children could not escape. I, with my weak group, was taken.
I think you're very strong, Jerry. I thought this is not a weak group. This row here is not a weak group. But let's hear it for Jerry. Good reading. What I found particularly compelling was the deep Icelandic accent in which you gave that. That was particularly perfect. In 1631, Murad led another destructive and lucrative raid on Baltimore, Ireland. Ireland, by the way, could have a whole lecture on Irish piracy, because at the time it was a nest of pirates as well. So this wanton raiding of the 17th century characterizes this sort of second phase of Barbary piracy, and sort of aligns with maybe the golden age of New World piracy as well. The most piratical era of the pirates was in this 17th century, which brings us to the third phase. And we get back to realpolitik here. I want to remind you, of course, of the fleet, Barbarossa's fleet in Toulon Harbor. As the Ottomans lose full control over the Ghazi states, the Europeans are forced to treat with them individually. And there were benefits and drawbacks to this. As Louis XIV said, quote, "If Algiers didn't exist, I'd invent it myself," because it was such a convenient thing to put the brakes on Italian trade to have this. Although, of course, he himself ends up at war with these states. This is from 1682, the bombardment of Algiers. It just gives you a sense of always having to balance the benefits of having these people out there, the enemies of my enemies, and they become a nuisance. There's no more Holy League here. Europeans are too frequently at war with each other in the 17th century to take concerted action to stop the North African corsairs. There were some exceptions. In 1618, I don't know how this came together considering the history of the time, a combined Spanish-Dutch fleet, they were not at the moment at the war with each other, fell upon a fleet of raiders in the Straits of Gibraltar. In 1620, a combined fleet of Dutch, English, and French ships defeated the renegade Ivan Durkee de Veerboer, another renegade known as Suleiman Race, and his 8-ship fleet. More common was a cycle of payment and retribution. So they would sign treaties, European states would sign treaties with the Ghazi states to agree to send an annual tribute to protect the ships from their nation. These treaties often aligned with different sides of European conflicts, right? So I sign a treaty with the Dey of Algiers not to attack French ships, but it's very convenient that they will attack the British ships. One way to think about these treaties, it's kind of like having privateers in your back pocket. If you sign a treaty, you get the fleet of this whole privateer thing working for you in your conflicts. These treaties, unfortunately, were often broken. If you have the new day every year, and the new day is like, screw this, it's time to go back out. I disagreed with this treaty in the first place. So they were broken often, and it becomes a cycle of signing a treaty and then having your port bombarded. And you can see here these retributive attacks that are going on from the early, I'm not going to read them all. I've highlighted one. This one right here is the attack from the United Kingdom and Netherlands in 1816. And this one here is the Algiers, France one, which is Louis XIV. But you can see that this was very common to come and sort of spank the Ghazi states and then sign a new treaty with them and start all over. This was a stable system, although it was a bit like controlled chaos in the 18th century. And to give you a sense, in the 1790s, by the time we get to the United States involvement in all of this, the Algiers tribute, annual tribute, included 24,000 pounds from Holland and Denmark, 130,000 from France, 280,000 from Great Britain, and 3 to 5 million for Spain. So it shows you, if you have a good Navy, you're probably going to be paying less, right? This big state treaty system is what exposed the United States merchantmen at the time. They were not part of this, and they were unprotected prey. So we come to the part that we all kind of know, right? A little bit. Americans lost the protection of Great Britain in 1775. And starting in 1785, the Dey of Algiers told his ship captains, go after American ships. Scores of American ships were seized, and crews and passengers in the hundreds were enslaved. There are whole stories, witness accounts of Americans and their capture in Algeria. The U.S. agreed to pay tribute in 1792, but there were delays in the implementation of this tribute that angered the Dey, and he retargeted American ships in the Atlantic. One cruise in 1794 took 10 ships and 105 prisoners, not just one cruise. And these were going out, weekly or monthly. The United States, in their agreement, agreed to pay $600,000 in a one-time payment, a $200,000 ransom for all Americans, and a $21,000 annual tribute. This was a huge expenditure. In fact, it was the largest item in the 1796 U.S. budget. Again, the payment was slow. The U.S. had to get this money from a bank in the old world, and they had little credit. The Americans don't know the system. So the attacks keep coming. In 1794, while all of this is happening, America's Navy was founded specifically to protect against this threat. 6 frigates were ordered. They have to stop working on one of them, however, to turn their attention to build a frigate for the Dey of Algiers called the USS Crescent, because he was impatient and wanted to be paid off. So we actually built one of our great new frigates for the Dey of Algiers. Meanwhile, the other Ghazi states are smelling blood in the water, right? Because, hey, look what Algiers got. So Tripoli demands a frigate too. And I'm not going to get into all of the negotiations and all of this, but on May 1801, Tripoli declares war on the United States. There was a weak U.S. blockade of Tripoli. We bombarded Tripoli in 1804. The idea, by the way, of these bombardments were, if you couldn't take the city itself, you could sink most of the ships in the harbor at least, right? Or reduce their fortifications. We certainly know the great stories, of course, of the Philadelphia running aground and Stephen Decatur going and rescuing it. I'm not going to go into all of these stories because we have Captain Preble over here who can give us all of these stories. Of course, the fighting at Derna here was the first planting of a U.S. flag on foreign soil. By the way, the shores of Tripoli, that was 8 U.S. Marines 8 US Marines and 400 mercenaries, Greek and Egyptian mercenaries. And interestingly enough, 90 soldiers who were serving a deposed Dey of Tripoli who wanted to get back into power. So there was the United States like being involved in the Ghazi state, machinations. The war ends with a treaty, a ransom was paid, promises were made, but there was no tribute in that one. After the Napoleonic Wars, everyone in the world is tired of the Ghazi states. There was war again in the United States, with the United States in 1815 against all of the states, the Ghazi states, but especially Algiers. And here we have the capture of the Mashuda, a square-rigged, larger sailing vessel by Stephen Decatur's U.S. squadron. This is matched by European clamping down on the coast. And again, that 1816 bombardment that I showed you in a previous slide. Europe at this point is no longer going to tolerate this. And Europe has the naval technology that had completely outpaced the Ghazi states and could enforce its will. Which brings us to where we started, the fall of Algiers, which was not done to stop piracy. In fact, why did the Dey of Algiers want that money so badly? Because the piracy wasn't bringing in money anymore. It was collecting old debts, right? Hussein Dey needed the money, the French wouldn't pay. So I want to review those 3 points I mentioned at the beginning, and hopefully maybe I've demonstrated them. The Barbary pirates were not an anomaly, but built off of a long tradition of piratical behavior in the Mediterranean. And again, at certain periods, especially in the 16th century, completely matched by their adversaries. 2, they had a religious motivation and justification for their behavior, no matter how cynically it was applied. Right? That's just the nature of religious motivations. And 3, they implemented policy and yielded state revenue. And so they were political actors and not just criminals. Now listen, none of this is meant to be exculpatory or changes the fact that they were violent, enslaving war criminals. Ending their menace at sea was undoubtedly a good thing. And by the way, folks, it's okay if you want to keep calling them pirates. I guess it's kind of like pornography. We know it when we see it, right? But what we call things matters a little. This anti-slavery rhetoric justified the destruction of these pirate states. And indeed, it animated all of 19th and 20th century European colonialism. It also provided colonialism cover for its own crimes, including brutal forced labor on a scale that dwarfed anything that happened in these Ghazi states over the course of the 300 years. And this is not to mention colonialism's brutality in North Africa itself. From 1830 to 1870, in the conquest of Algeria, the French government was responsible for the death, disappearance of half the Algerian population. As many as 1.2 million Algerians were murdered or starved to death in a 40-year period of time. In the 1950s, the people who wanted to get the French out of Algiers and bombed civilians to do so were called terrorists. So I guess I'd like to say pirates are kind of like terrorists. It depends on your perspective. And that's what I got for the Barbary pirates. Thank you. And Paul, how much time do we have for questions? Okay. If we push 7, okay, great. Well, I'm going to go around to make sure that the people in the audience can hear you and in the online audience can hear. And we'll start with Joe Sitter. Joe.
How did the Romans do it? The Romans aren't known for being a seafaring power. So they eliminated large-scale piracy from the entire Mediterranean. I'm impressed.
Yeah, very impressive. It actually was the grid system I mentioned. Pompey came up with an idea saying if we actually can get, first of all, the Romans, if they want to get something done, they'll get it done, right? And we kind of learned that about the Romans. They essentially divided the system of, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, into a series of grids and cleared and made sure there were people watching one grid and clear out one grid and make sure they get a pin on who was there and get them in that one. I mean, it required incredible effort and incredible shipbuilding. So Plutarch gives us a really good story, numbers of ships and whatnot, but it was a long campaign. It wasn't done in a year, but it was thorough and detailed. And like the Romans, they're very efficient. So Rome had to become a seafaring power when it fought the Punic Wars. When Rome was facing a thalassocracy like Carthage, it had to actually develop a navy, and did so quite successfully, especially by, I'd say, 200 BCE. But we're really out of my era of expertise, but I do know that. Paul.
I'm starting a little bit with the notion of to what extent, and you've addressed it, but it's still a little including me, that the Barbary pirates could be seen as state actors, and that incorporates, just by giving the clarification, are these declared wars, or these are just an eternal war against the infidel, as it could be adopted by anyone in Islam? Is there any code of conduct? It seems like is so long as it's an infidel, there was none. You weren't. So I was just wondering, to what extent was it formalized? Is it some government that is giving them a nod and a wink and taking tribute, or is there actual directed state policy and an actual formal war?
Certainly, I think the answer to that is, if you think about the phases of this, and again, there are exceptions to all of this. 16th century, we got committed holy warriors, right? This is what this 17th century, we have really loose cannons where you really are, but so long as they provide their booty to the state, they're sanctioned. It's where the most cynical sort of pirate behavior would be in that middle period. By the 18th century, it really is formalized. And it really is a matter of the state being able to say, don't attack British ships, don't attack French ships, you can attack these ships. And there were formal treaties, like I said, and so Tripoli declaring war on the United States is a sign of the real politicization of this, that this behavior was now part of a state policy. You don't ever hear about Saleh declaring war on Iceland or anything like that, because it was more just, we can use this holy war as a justification, and it's a state action because it pays the state coffers, as long as we pay the state coffers. So, I mean, like all of this, there are exceptions, and there's like, what are people really doing? And, is Englishman Jack Ward out there thinking to himself, I'm committed to the holy war when I do this? No. Interesting thing about this, though, I was reading one of the scholars saying, like, yes, there are certain committed people, religious people that are very committed and willing to sacrifice their lives for this holy war. But the renegades aren't, but they are. The reason they are is because if renegades were captured, guess what happened to them? Immediately they'd be killed by the Christian, so if you were in the 17th century. So that'll motivate you just as much as the religious motivation, right? You'll become, and you'll use the language of jihad, and you'll use all of that. The 18th century, it really is it's a state business. And again, this idea of, you don't have to do as much piracy if you're getting annual tribute. And when you don't get the tribute, you turn on the piracy. And then the new day, it's just, so is that kind of answering your question? Absolutely. Good question. Absolutely. Internecine warfare, 100%. And, just like anything, the communist's worst enemy is a socialist, like they might use religious justification to say the day of Tunis is given up. And certainly, Istanbul's influence would always kind of come in and come out. And, and you could maybe get closer to Istanbul for some political purpose that might make Algiers in a better situation than Tunis. So there's definitely internecine things. There's the fuzziness, Paul, as you know, is always there. And certainly there's a lot of murder between, well, just like there is between Christians and Christians on the seas. There's plenty of that with the Muslims, especially struggling for power, right, in these situations. I'll go to Brent, and then I'll come over here to David. Brent, what you got for us?
In the early 1800s, those U.S. flag merchant ships, what were they carrying back and forth, and where were they carrying it to get involved in all this?
That's a very detailed question. I would assume the products that are available in the Mediterranean. Like I mentioned at the beginning, they could be high volume products, high price products like spices, but they could also simply be olive oil, timber, coffee, right? They said it when the Algiers, they came back with coffee. It's like, that's very specific, isn't it? So I would assume any number of products, be they high value or mundane, right? There is very little evidence of using slave markets in North Africa for United States or slavery in the Western Hemisphere, but I'm getting out of my knowledge base here. Bill. Oh, yeah, actually, I can do it. David, no, he's promised.
Right. Just a quick comment first. I'm told that Cervantes actually gave a cameo appearance to Ulucali, that Italian, the Calabrian, Algerian in Don Quixote. He appears yeah. A little parochial question. I understand that the Venetians also had piracy issues with the Dalmatian coast. Do you have any insights on the piracy out of the Dalmatian coast from their side of it?
Yeah, so the mostly what you're talking about, the Uskoks, USKOK, coming out of the port of Senj, SENJ. This was contemporaneous with the issue of the Ottomans. Now it's just a typical mercenary thing. They were serving the Christian cause against the Ottomans, but they became, as I mentioned earlier, one of these sort of thalassocratic pirate groups that the Venetians couldn't control either, and they ended up having to go to war. I'm going to get my dates mixed up on that, but you can look them up, USKOK, Uskoks, and that would be in the Adriatic. And again, they exerted a lot of power off the Dalmatian coast and were friendly until they weren't. Bill, I had a question here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you mentioned the 1.2 million slaves that these people were trading in, or at least captured, how many of them, if they were willing to convert, could they become gradually at least integrated into the social order?
100%. And that's why it's tough to use a number like that and sort of make comparisons, like, across slavery and across numbers and whatnot. It's no guarantee, but many, many, many people could convert and be integrated into the society. And there were 6,000 houses in the late 17th century in Algiers that were held by renegados. I have no idea what the percentage is, but I would assume not insignificant proportion of them might have started out enslaved, manumitted, then their kids are just members of the Algerian society. So that's why the numbers are really hard because of this, because of ransoms. We don't count them where they're enslaved, we count them. At any time, one scholar estimated that the Ghazi state industry needed about 25,000 slaves a year to maintain this. But we have no way of testing that. In the 1790s, we know that Algiers had on average about 3,000 slaves, European slaves, on each year in Algiers itself. That's considerably lower than we would have seen in earlier centuries. But numbers are really hard for these very reasons. Ransoming, manumission through conversion, and all of that make the numbers hard to kind of one-to-one correlation. We know that nearly every West African slave, we know they went and were slaves in the Western Hemisphere. We just don't have the same type of data for this type of slavery. Do you have a question on this side? Okay, question. Paul, how are we doing on time? 2 minutes. Okay, John.
My question is about, you're using a term like the Ottoman Empire. As we get out west in the Mediterranean, I would bet it's a long way to Istanbul from all these places we're talking about. And the reality is that most of these city-states they did their own thing. And so then that gets at the fundamental thought of piracy. It's really acts that are on the edge. We can talk about war if we have states, but if we don't have states, then maybe all of us are just doing kind of piracy. Take the American West. I mean, what the hell was going on in Wyoming, or what's still going on in Wyoming? I guess is a valid question. But my thought is that we need to recognize that such things as the Ottoman Empire is a very fuzzy thing, especially later on in the time. They conquer, they do a good job of that, but then it's a long way to Istanbul.
Sure is, and 100%. These states, we have to think of the political allegiance of these states by the 18th century. They never give up, because it's important to be part of Dar al-Islam. It's important to be part of the world of Islam and to acknowledge the Sultan and to be part of that world. So they would acknowledge it in name only, but they're entirely, essentially independent. I will say that the Ottoman Empire was very interested in reasserting control in the end of the 18th century. And you see some efforts to try to regularize and negotiate with the independent states to kind of bring in more revenue, help them bring in more revenue so that their tribute to Istanbul can be more regular. This is why I didn't get into the interior, because this was a whole, I do this in my class where I talk about the Ottomans had already started, or at least through the day of Algiers, to try to bring some administration to the interior of the country. Piracy wasn't making as much money. How do you get taxes out of the revenue on the land? I've gone in a different direction than that, but your observations are absolutely correct, that this is very, very tenuous connection to the Ottoman Empire for sure. And I think that is all the time I have, folks. I want to thank the Barbary Pirates for giving me this idea, but thank you for your questions, and we'll be returning in just a few minutes to hear Piracy in the New World. Talk to you soon.